We are so obsessed with the recipes. We make sure that we have all the right ingredients to create the perfect looking dish that is sure to satisfy. But how often do you think about where your ingredients come from? Take this fried chicken. Is this chicken raised in the Philippines? Was it locally sourced, or did it come from another part of the world? What if, one day, all food importation stopped? Does the Philippines produce enough food to feed itself? According to the World Food Summit of 1996, food security exists when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs. There are 4 pillars of food security: food availability, food access, food use, and food stability. Sadly, the Philippines falls short of these standards. According to a United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization report, over 59 million Filipinos suffered from moderate to severe lack of consistent access to food from 2017 to 2019, the highest number of food insecure people in Southeast Asia. To add to that, chronic hunger is up by 10 million people in 1 year and up by nearly 60 million in 5 years all over the world. Almost 690 million people went hungry in 2019, with numbers highest in Asia and rising fastest in Africa. If these trends continue, over 840 million people will be hungry by 2030, with Africa surpassing Asia as the region affected the most. With a COVID-19 pandemic, more than 100 million people could be added to this unsettling figure. But overcoming hunger is just one side of the coin. 2 billion people do not have regular access to safe, nutritious, and sufficient food.
Under this pandemic, there are 2 or 3 most priority programs. These are foremost concern areas. One, of course, is the health. Our health response to the pandemic is so critical in order to normalize the situation in the country. The second concern is really about food security. We need to eat, to have to ensure that people will eat during this pandemic because of certain constraints already in the delivery of food, logistics, constraints in terms of mobility of people who will be producing. So it is important to ensure that. And if you look at statistics on hunger, I don't know whether you're aware of the SWS survey. The September survey said that revealed that about 35 million Filipinos went hungry for at least a day because of this pandemic. Then recently, the November 3 to December 3 survey of the Department of Science and Technology said 62% are going hungry, not because of the lack of food, but the lack of money or means to buy food. So in other words, the threat of hunger is as real as the threat of the pandemic. If people become hungry and they go to the stage of starvation, they can become desperate. So it is important for us to keep on continuing this dialogue about ensuring food security to our people. It's not only the concern of agriculture, it is the concern of ordinary consumers.
We've had these issues in the Philippines for decades. The pandemic only accentuated what was already happening. The Philippines has one of the highest population growth rates in Southeast Asia, which is why it's so important for the local agro industry to thrive.
We also need to protect our farmers. There are many of them, and unfortunately, a lot of them are poor. And therefore, if we allow the inflows of cheap imports that directly compete with their products, you will further aggravate their poverty situation. So we have to be very careful in terms of the imports that come in. The ideal objective or the desirable objective for any country is what you call food security, not food self-sufficiency. What is the difference between these two concepts? Food self-sufficiency means that you need to produce all food commodities within your borders or country. Food security means that you have to maintain adequate supply of that commodity at affordable prices by producing it locally or importing them outside. In Singapore, it is more food secure than the Philippines. But we all know that Singapore is a small country, cannot produce all its food requirements, isn't it? It can only produce a certain portion of their food supply, but it imports a lot. But is it less secure than the Philippines? No, it is higher in terms of food security. Why is this so? Why is Singapore doing that? Because it is most economical to import commodities which you don't have the necessary land or the necessary managerial capability to produce, or that you do not have the necessary agroclimatic or environmental conditions. Because if you do that, it will be very, very expensive. You have to balance, as I said earlier, between the interests of the consumers who always want lower prices for the commodities and the farmers who are producing who always want a higher prices for their produce.
Currently, the Philippines is a net food importer. We import food more than we export, which is strange because we are still primarily an agricultural country. While there's nothing essentially wrong with being a net importer, you need to understand that there's a need to strike a balance between allowing imports and supporting local producers. It impacts the entire local value chain, which, in turn, affects your daily life and the food that reaches your table. The key to this balance is to allow local producers to produce the finished product like chicken and liberalize the importation of raw materials like corn until the local supply chain can meet the total demand and bring down prices. In fact, from 2015 to 2019, there was a surplus of local chicken produced. To give you an idea of how importation could impact the lives of people across industries and not just poultry farmers, take a look at this local value chain. It all starts with the corn needed to feed the chickens. The corn farmers supply corn consolidators and traders who then turn the produce over to the corn logistics people. The corn then goes to poultry farms and distributors who give it to those who handle feed logistics, who finally give the corn feeds to the poultry farmers. When the chicken is ready, chicken consolidators and traders come in. Then the produce is handled by transfer logistics, which brings it to the chicken dressing plants. After the chickens are dressed, they are transferred to the cold storage facilities, then turned over to HRIS traders and retailers, then to retailers and supermarkets, then to retailers receiving and overhead. And finally, to the grocery, where you probably got your chicken. That's how long and complicated the journey of the chicken is before it reaches your kitchen. Now, imagine the thousands, perhaps even millions of Filipinos whose livelihood depends on the chicken that goes on your table. The farmers, the millers, retailers, manual laborers, truck operators, down to the feed plant engineers, nutritionists, veterinarians, and so on. Yes, it affects more people than you realize. And you know what affects the whole local value chain more? It's how chicken is becoming the staple and stable protein choice. In the Philippines, the major sources of calories, proteins, and fats are chicken, chicken egg, and pork. Pork has now become more expensive in the market, which has made consumers turn to chicken more. As you can imagine, this, along with the implications of the pandemic, has affected the local value chain even more.
The pandemic, COVID crisis, had a major impact on chicken production. We reduced our production involuntarily because of the oversupply situation caused by the lockdown back in March. We were requesting the Department of Agriculture to temporarily stop importation so that we can maintain the breeder base for broiler production. Unfortunately, the Department of Agriculture decided otherwise, and because the breeder side of the business could not sustain the losses, the industry ended up reducing production in order to survive or minimize losses or cut losses. However, because demand also went down because of the lockdown, because of the closure of the hotel, restaurants, and institutional buyers, which is about 30% of the demand or the market, have been able to meet local demand and at the same time meet the additional substitution demand from pork. And in terms of production parameters, efficiencies, with great pride I can say your local industry is at par with the world without the subsidies provided by other countries to their agricultural sector. There is this notion that imports will provide consumers with cheaper alternatives to locally produced chicken. However, we have a 5-year data set in our website. There you will see no matter what is the volume of importation, it has no impact on retail prices. Its impact normally, in a normal year, the impact of import volumes would be on farm gate prices. But on retail, no impact at all.
Imports increased from 340 million kilos in 2019 to 402 million kilos in 2020. This happened despite reduced demand during the pandemic. So why are we still importing chicken if our local production is clearly enough to meet demand?
The policy there is that we need to be very strict in terms of the entry of chicken parts that directly compete with our products, for example, whole chicken, but not necessarily for chicken parts that are not in sufficient supply in the Philippines. That's basically the policy direction that the government should be taking, and that's what the Department of Agriculture is taking right now.
In 2019, Filipino industries lost an estimated 96 billion pesos worth of livelihood from poultry farmers and producers, corn and agri farmers, feed millers, truck drivers, porters, and corn farmers considered to be among the poorest of the poor. Displaced income due to chicken importation is estimated at 98 billion pesos in 2020, putting the 200 billion pesos a year industry at risk. Disheartening, isn't it? While it may not be as simple as it seems, there are ways to start doing things right when it comes to food security and managing the effects of importation.
If you look at the data on government budget for agriculture, it is only about 4% of the total government budget. But the sector, just the agricultural sector, contributes around 10% of your economy. So there is a huge disparity or discrepancy between what the sector contributes to the economy and what the sector is getting in terms of budgetary support from the government. And that partly explains your low productivity in the agricultural sector. Remember, there is an economic principle again that says that growth is a function of investment. If you don't invest, there is no growth. So inadequate investment in agriculture leads eventually to poor agricultural performance. And this is not just this, this is successive administration I'm referring to. And that's the reason why we are suffering that kind of misallocation of resources.
The DA should put in place a national information network, meaning a network of data and information so that all players, businessmen, farmers, government agencies would have a common basis for making decisions. Right now, we are all blind. By having this data system, this information system, there will be confidence in the way we import goods, that there will be minimal smuggling, if any, and that correct tariffs would be collected and there will be no misdeclaration. It should have a data system which all players, all stakeholders can take a look at and make rational business decisions, because we are supposed to be a free enterprise country, and a free enterprise country is anchored on information, cannot go at it alone.
You might be thinking, what can we, as ordinary people and consumers, do to help at the very least?
Aside from education, aside from informing people, I do not see how consumers can influence policy. They can do so by their pocketbooks, by their wallets. If they support locally produced food, that would help.
Importation, food security, and food sufficiency are as complex as far as any crucial world issue goes. So many layers, so many stakeholders, but too little attention. While it's impossible to make everybody happy, you can make a difference even in small ways. First, build local and buy local whenever you can. Promote affordability, accessibility, and availability of local chicken and food in general. By doing so, you reaffirm the livelihood of our local farmers and producers and give value to their role in food security. Yes, it takes a lot of hard work, but we can build a sustainable local agricultural value chain together. One that's designed with data-driven policies and support to our Filipino stakeholders. Trade and importation are an important part of the economy, but it has to be calibrated properly. As was seen with rice in previous years, if the systems are not in place to control what comes into the country, whether legally or smuggled, it can affect more than just the price of food on your plate. It can cost the livelihood of millions of people. Just like how you control what you like to eat, you can decide where those ingredients come from.